Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and I apologize for sending the long version of the bio, which is probably longer than my entire presentation. I had been asked to speak to you today about the current state of Al-Qaeda, and my first reaction to this was sheer horror. How does one say anything useful in 15 minutes or less to such a qualified audience about the current state of Al-Qaeda, which is a subject that there are many competing viewpoints on. Nevertheless, I will give it my best shot, and what I'll try to do in the presentation is basically walk you through the basic arguments, one viewpoint representing the view that Al-Qaeda is in trouble and that it is suffering, and the other viewpoint saying that Al-Qaeda is actually thriving. And hopefully this overview will serve to more detailed discussion in the plenaries. So first, the viewpoint that Al-Qaeda is in trouble. Proponents of this argument point to the fact that much of Al-Qaeda's senior leadership was decimated. No less than 40 senior leaders of Al-Qaeda had been killed in drone strikes in Pakistan and Yemen, with many others being arrested and jailed. Most notably, of course, Osama bin Laden's elimination in May 2011 has led to optimism that Al-Qaeda is no longer the organization that it once was, especially now that bin Laden has been succeeded by the notoriously uncharismatic Ayman al-Zawahiri. Proponents of this argument also argue that Al-Qaeda Central currently has quite a limited reach in terms of its ability to coordinate the attacks by its regional affiliates and other organizations that have taken the Al-Qaeda brand name on board, however tend to operate frequently independently. Optimists also thought that the Arab Spring, in the initial months after the Arab Spring started, would take the wind from the sails of Al-Qaeda in terms of demonstrating that a revolution in the Middle East could happen completely without the contribution of radical Islamist ideology. And Al-Qaeda played a limited role, of course, in Libya and practically no role in Tunisia and Egypt. And so the argument was that Al-Qaeda's narrative lost steam because of it. Then proponents of the argument that Al-Qaeda is in trouble point to the fact that there has not been a single attack in the West that has succeeded since the July 7th, 2005 bombings on the underground in London. So basically, for 8 years, we have not seen a successful terrorist attack by Al-Qaeda in the West, which has caused some to conclude that Al-Qaeda is struggling. And of course, Al-Qaeda is also operating in an environment where it's much more difficult for them to succeed, given counterterrorism efforts and the fact that Al-Qaeda is being hunted in many places in the world. It's also been argued that Al-Qaeda does not have a good constructive appeal. In other words, much of Al-Qaeda's popularity in the Muslim world was derived from nihilism, if you will, from Al-Qaeda basically representing a force that could strike the perceived bully, the Americans or the West. But outside of that, Al-Qaeda never really had much popular support in terms of their constructive plan. There are very few Muslims in the world who would want to live under the Al-Qaeda flag. So this is another viewpoint that seems to show that Al-Qaeda does not have what it takes to thrive and survive. It's also been argued that there's a limited generational changeover within Al-Qaeda. Much like companies like Apple will struggle with their iPhone simply because in the next generation, kids won't want the iPhone because that's what the dad had, right? Who wants the same cell phone that the father has? And it's a question whether Al-Qaeda will remain the hip brand that it is today. And finally, the proponents, the optimists of the viewpoint that Al-Qaeda is in trouble point to the fact that there's significant infighting within Al-Qaeda and its various affiliate organizations. And one only needs to look at some of the documents that were recovered in Timbuktu in northern Mali and the exchange that took place between the Al-Qaeda and Islamic Maghreb leadership and Mukhtar Belmokhtar, who was reprimanded for the disobedience to the group. And it's kind of an interesting document to look at. A lot of news stories have been published that you can read in detail about this exchange. Now, of course, not everybody shares this optimistic view, and we also have another viewpoint, and that is that Al-Qaeda is still a significant threat. And which side of this debate you take very much depends on how you define Al-Qaeda. If you focus on Al-Qaeda purely as Al-Qaeda Central or what it once was in Afghanistan, then perhaps you might conclude that Al-Qaeda is in trouble. If, however, you use the definition of Al-Qaeda as a broader movement and incorporate the activities of the affiliate groups and various ideological allies that have not necessarily claimed the Al-Qaeda name but seem to operate under the same ideology. And in conjunction with Al-Qaeda's strategy, then we might conclude that Al-Qaeda in fact is thriving. Also, while we have seen limited amount of success in terms of attacks against Western targets in the West, Al-Qaeda affiliates have been tremendously successful in terms of attacks in Muslim countries. And it stands to be noted here that over 90% of all Al-Qaeda victims today are actually Muslims, which, by the way, is another thing that is undermining Al-Qaeda. So Al-Qaeda affiliate groups have chosen to focus much more on the near enemy for the moment, opportunistically looking at options to strike at the West, but this has not been the priority. So pessimists say that the reason why we have not seen too many successful attacks in the West should not make us complacent on this issue. We can also say that the Al-Qaeda narrative is far from dead. The level of romanticism that many, especially Western jihadis, have out of going into Syria, Pakistan, and other places to fight still bears some sort of attraction. There are still some grievances that Al-Qaeda claims to represent that strike the emotional chord with people in the Muslim world. We should also recognize that we cannot measure Al-Qaeda's performance solely on the number of attacks which they mount and number of people which they manage to kill. Al-Qaeda is also paying great amount of attention and is learning from past mistakes in relation to having a more constructive message. And if you follow the media that comes out of the Syrian conflict at the moment, the Islamic State of Iraq and Al-Sham, as well as the Jabhat al-Nusra, have published widely the reconstruction efforts which they engage in, distribution of bread, improving of water delivery services, even holding a family day in which there are various games for children and ice cream is distributed. So Al-Qaeda is very much trying to be a much more constructive organization in these respective theaters so that they are not seen purely as a fighting force. This is one of the things that you see in the Abbottabad documents. Bin Laden's concern that Al-Qaeda's name could be tarnished if it is used solely in association with violent activity. So this is one thing that we need to be aware of, that Al-Qaeda is definitely trying to become more mainstream and more acceptable as a constructive group. And again, some of the Timbuktu documents clearly show how Al-Qaeda in Mali was instructed to not implement Sharia too strictly and too fast because it could undermine this message. And basically comparing the Al-Qaeda Malian people relationship to a relationship between a parent and a child. Some senior Al-Qaeda leaders have argued that the Sharia implementation needs to take place slowly and only over time needs to be introduced. We can also say that there is reason for pessimism in the sense that Al-Qaeda is now active in multiple theaters. Before September 11th, Al-Qaeda's activity, where they could really operate freely, could be limited basically to Afghanistan. But now we have Al-Qaeda governing space in Yemen, operating with impunity in the federally administered tribal areas of Pakistan. We see them in Mali, we see them in Nigeria, and in other places. So to a great extent, Al-Qaeda has become a greater challenge now, precisely because it is diffuse. Pessimists also point to the fact that the Arab Spring, as optimistic as it looked in the beginning, of course, hurt all counterterrorism efforts to date. The dictatorial regime of Mubarak, for instance, had a quite robust intelligence structure that can help fight jihadist groups. That structure has, of course, disappeared, and all the events that we have seen in Egypt recently seem to confirm and fuel Al-Qaeda's ideology more so than diminishing it. So this was quite a overly optimistic view of the so-called Arab Spring. We, of course, have to worry about Syria, and there'll be a tremendous amount of discussion about Syria, so I'll skip this part. Of course, we see Al-Qaeda on the rise again in Iraq, with a great number of people getting killed in attacks that seem to happen just about every other day, suicide bombings that happen every other day currently. We don't devote as much attention to it anymore because the West is no longer as strongly present as in the past. Nevertheless, Al-Qaeda is resurgent in Iraq. We also have to worry about what happens to Afghanistan and also Pakistan and the Central Asian neighborhood in the wake of the pullout of international troops from Afghanistan in 2014. Is Al-Qaeda going to have another playground, if you will, in Afghanistan as it had before September 11th? We also have to take note of the numerous jailbreaks that we've seen in recent months in Yemen, in Libya, in Iraq, in Pakistan, in Nigeria. Numerous senior Al-Qaeda operatives were freed in massive jailbreak operations, some of which were quite impressive in the modus operandi which they used and the amount of infiltration and planning then went into these jailbreaks. So it's not just a question of how many Al-Qaeda people are arrested and put into jails, but also how many Al-Qaeda members are sprung free in jailbreaks or let go in various peace agreements. There was a number of senior Taliban people released in Pakistan just yesterday as a part of a broader peace negotiation effort with the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan. And finally, we also have to worry about the homegrown threat. Basically, no matter what we do on the counterterrorism front in relation to Al-Qaeda, will eliminate the threat of the so-called lone wolves that have already been discussed here. They're simply too small of entities to really be eliminated and intercepted every single time. As I have about 3 minutes left, let me go into some basic conclusions. First of all, I want to say that perhaps the first perspective is too optimistic. Nevertheless, the second perspective is perhaps too pessimistic. There have been significant successes in the fight against Al-Qaeda, and to some extent, we have to be careful not to give Al-Qaeda this bubble of invincibility by focusing on it too much. We should also be aware, however, of the limitations of our analysis of Al-Qaeda. It's very difficult to study Al-Qaeda systematically. Many of the documents are classified. Getting access inside the organization for interviews with its members is tremendously difficult. And every once in a while, there's a news report or a certain event that happens which challenges your thinking about Al-Qaeda and where it actually is right now. I think the closure of the U.S. embassies in different countries about a month ago and the fact that it was triggered by a teleconference of Zawahiri and various other Al-Qaeda-linked groups that was happening in real time, I think this is really what surprised a lot of the analysts who claimed that Zawahiri has very limited reach and very limited influence over the regional affiliates. So we need to be aware of the limitations of our understanding and to know that we're really looking at the tip of the iceberg. And there's a lot of room for us to be wrong, simply, in our analysis. The threat has become more diffuse, therefore more difficult to follow. We should also be very, very careful to not make Al-Qaeda assessments too Western-centric. Like I said, the majority of victims of Al-Qaeda are Muslims in Muslim countries. We can have a discussion here or in Washington, D.C. about whether Al-Qaeda is thriving or not. When you speak to villagers in Nigeria or Pakistan, to them Al-Qaeda is very much alive, and they see the threat there every day. And by the way, this to me is one of the greatest successes that we've had in the fight against Al-Qaeda, is the fact that in Muslim countries, it's no longer perceived as some sort of a Western construct. And I think many people in Muslim countries are viewing it as a threat that's very real, and it's a threat to them as well. There's a great debate about whether it's time to declare victory on Al-Qaeda. Obviously, this is very dangerous and unrealistic for any politician to ever do, because any small attack that happens will make that politician pay. At the same time, I think we should have a discussion about what would it take for us to actually declare a victory on Al-Qaeda. What are the parameters for a success? Because like I said, we need to make sure that we do not keep Al-Qaeda alive constantly and making it appear stronger than it actually is. And this is a final comment that I'll make in my last 41 seconds. And that has to do with the counterterrorism dilemma, which is phrased basically as a knockoff of the security dilemma, a basic concept in international relations. And that to me is, how do you maintain enough focus and enough resources in securing against the Al-Qaeda threat and in making sure that you don't become complacent, while at the same time not feeding the threat and not giving it that terror value that it seeks. So striking that balance, to me, is one of the biggest challenges that we have. So thank you very much.